Well, good morning. About time to begin our Bible class this morning. Good to see everybody. Before we begin this morning, we'll start with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Most kind, gracious Father in heaven, so grateful for this Lord's Day you've given us, Father, and the opportunity we have to assemble together this morning and take part in this Bible class hour, Father. And we're grateful for your inspired word, and that we have it, Father, so freely given to us today, Father, that we can study it. Pray we'll always be good stewards of your word, that we'll study your word, Father, and learn from it, and we can be better every day, Father, in our Christian walk. And pray for your forgiveness for any sins that are missing in our life, and know that we're human and we sin each day, and just pray for your continued blessings upon us, Father, in everything we do, and pray for your blessings upon those that we're mindful of that are sick or hurting, Father. Know that there's always those that desire prayers on our behalf, and pray you'll be with those, Father, that we're mindful of, and bless them as only you can. And again, pray for your blessings upon us as we go into this Bible class hour, and pray for your blessings as well as we start the worship service here in a little while, Father. Pray that everything we do here this morning is done in a way that's pleasing to you. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're still in Matthew chapter 24. Last week, we made it through verse 6, so we finished verse 6. We looked at where Jesus mentions the wars and rumors of wars. We talked about, we reviewed some of the history of Judea, a little bit of the area around Judea, and showed that since the establishment of the Roman Empire in Judea about the year 6 A.D., that the government had been very stable, that there was relative peace in Judea from A.D. 6 for about the next 60 years. So the idea that when Jesus tells the disciples that there, these wars and rumors of wars that you're going to hear about, that you're going to see, it would have been significant to them. It was a little bit different time than what we could say even we live in today with the wars and rumors of wars that we might hear of. So Jesus made that prediction that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and then we looked at the history there and how that prediction came to pass, and how we saw that those things happened, and exactly how Jesus had said it, because it really started as a rumor. Maybe it wasn't a full-on Jewish revolt right off the bat. It started as sort of a localized thing and spread out from there. So, but we saw how that prediction that Jesus made came to pass. This morning we'll look at verses 7 and 8, and again we'll do the same thing. We'll kind of look at some of the history and see how these predictions have come to pass exactly how Jesus said they would. So if we begin in just to review verse 6, because it somewhat applies to verse 7. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, see that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So if we look at, if we hone in on verse 7, the first thing we'll notice is Jesus says, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. That really fits with what he mentioned in verse number 6. But I think it points out the fact that they will hear of these. They will hear of wars and rumors of wars, maybe things that are distant, that are not in Jerusalem per se, or not throughout the entire the area of Judea. But you might live in a place, and I might be a place that just hears of. As of right now, is just hearing of a war. Maybe there's rumors of war, but I think what he's saying is you'll see that that it won't be a rumor forever. Eventually, there's wars coming. You'll see wars in your area. There'll be nations rising against nation. There'll be kingdom against kingdom. And of course, the idea that the Jews revolted against the Roman Empire would fit that, obviously, but also we looked at last week how once the Jewish revolt had started, that the Jews in all areas were being really massacred by the Gentiles or the Greeks or whoever they were, outside of Jerusalem. We looked at Caesarea, and there were some other cities that were mentioned by Josephus and others, where literally tens of thousands of Jews were murdered. So it was, that was somewhat in response to the Jewish revolt, but the idea of nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom obviously came to pass as well. So we saw some of that when we were looking at verse number 6. But then Jesus mentions in verse 7 famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. So, of course, we can see that these things were fulfilled as well. And it's sort of interesting that the first fulfillment that we can look at for famines is actually in the New Testament itself. In Acts chapter 11, we hear of a famine starting in verse number 27. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch. There stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So the word for dearth there is the same Greek word that Jesus used for famine in Matthew 24 verse 7. So it's the same word, but it was translated as dearth here, but it means the same thing as famine, which is scarcity of harvest. But you've got this individual named Agabus. It says that he stood up and signified by the Spirit that there would be great dearth or great famine throughout the world. So he predicted this again. But then you have this little notices which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. So again, it's if you look at when did Claudius Caesar reign? If you go back a couple of emperors, I guess. Tiberius Caesar was the one that reigned mostly through Jesus' life. Then you had Caligula, and then Claudius came after Caligula. So Claudius reigned from about 41 to 54 AD, and there's a significant famine recorded in the year 45 AD of his reign. And this says again, this was during the days of Claudius Caesar. Seems to be most likely this was referencing the famine, the great famine in 45 AD. So again, you've got Jesus making a prediction. We see the fulfillment, and I think it's interesting that we even see the fulfillment of this one, in the New Testament itself. We have another example of famine mentioned by Josephus. He says, now her coming, her being Helena, the king's mother, her coming was of very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem, for whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to procure food withal. Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexandria with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others of them brought these provisions, which was done very quickly. She distributed food to those that were in want of it, and left a most excellent memorial behind her of this benefaction that she bestowed on our whole nation. So Josephus gives a reference here. I couldn't find a good date of this famine, but it would have been roughly in the time frame that we're speaking of. But some people would say that this was actually the same famine that was referenced in Acts 11. This could have been the same famine in 45 AD under the reign of Claudius. But either way, there's this would be sometime in the same time frame that we're talking about. So Jesus mentions pestilences next. He said these are signs, obviously, like we've said, these are signs that he's given, with the idea being that they're pointing to when his disciples should flee Jerusalem, right? That's where he's headed. So these are the signs that are pointing to that. So after famines, he gives pestilences, which is not really any good. I couldn't find any real good instances of pestilences being reported during this time. But several sources make this note or sort of similar note that says pestilences are the usual attendants of famine. So a lot of historians would say that if you have a severe famine, generally you'll have a pestilence either at the same time or somewhat following that famine. So, but I couldn't find any references specifically mention pestilences by themselves. But Jesus then mentions earthquakes, I think it's interesting. So sometimes when we say earthquakes, that looks like in diverse places. And I used to work with a guy who took that to mean diverse places, as in like in the sea or in the ocean, under the water. But that doesn't have an apostrophe. So it's not saying it's divers, not the place that divers go. That word actually means more, well, we would say diverse. But I've seen some people take it as divers. This guy took it as divers, and he would say that earthquakes in diverse places would be the equivalent of tsunamis. And he was referencing some tsunamis that have happened in our lifetimes as being, significant related to this. But even aside from all the fact that it's not related, just the word there really means more diverse, not divers under the ocean. But Jesus mentions earthquakes in diverse places. Not surprisingly, there are many examples of earthquakes during this time frame, between the time frame of, this is just say 33 AD, when Jesus is given these predictions. Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70. So between that time frame, there's many examples of earthquakes, just as Jesus predicted. So Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, he records for us, he says, a number of prodigies occurred in this year. He's referencing the year AD 51. He says, birds of ill omen settled on the capital. There were several earthquakes which shook down houses. And as the panic spread, many weak people were trampled to death. The deficient harvest and the dearth which ensued were regarded as a portent. So again, he mentions the earthquakes. He mentions the famine as well. And this is in AD 51. So this famine most likely would have been a different famine than the famine mentioned in AD 45, I guess, or I guess it could have conceivably lasted from 45 to 51. But anyway, you've got Tacitus, a Roman historian, who's recording the earthquakes that happened and the famines that happened in his area. In the book An Eschatology of Victory, the author here, J. Marcellus Kick, takes a lot of effort and looks at a lot of history and things associated with the events of Matthew 24. He says that as to earthquakes, many are mentioned by writers during a period just previous to AD 70. There were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania, Rome, and Judea. It is interesting to note that the city of Pompeii, which was much damaged by an earthquake occurring on February 5th, 62 AD. So most people are probably familiar with at least Pompeii in some way or fashion. Mount Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii. That was a little bit later, but it actually happened due to some earthquakes. We're talking about Rome, right? The Roman Empire. Pompeii was in Italy, so it was part of the Roman Empire. The famous earthquakes heralding the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii occurred on February 5th, 62 AD. This earthquake damaged much of Pompeii and the area around the Bay of Naples. Another smaller earthquake followed in 64 AD. The city was destroyed in 79 AD by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that was brought on by these earthquakes. In fact, minor earthquakes were reported in the 4 days preceding the eruption, but they were not recognized as being alarming since the occurrence of these earthquakes had become so prevalent in the region. So you've got the city of Pompeii that was destroyed because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right? It was destroyed because of the volcanic eruption. But these earthquakes is what led to the volcanic eruption to begin with. But you've got, the city wasn't destroyed until 79 AD. But you've got all these earthquakes going back all the way at least to 62 AD. And these earthquakes, at least in 62 and 64, caused significant damage to the city. And some sources say that the damage that occurred in 62 was not even yet fully repaired by the time the city was destroyed in 79 AD. But I think what's significant is there was many earthquakes that occurred during this time, but the earthquakes were so common in the region that nobody took it as alarming. The city was destroyed in 79 because nobody took the earthquakes as being particularly alarming. And it says, this says that they reported earthquakes 4 days prior to the eruption. So I think that's interesting, especially in light of Jesus' prediction about earthquakes. You see this as being a part of the Roman Empire. At least this city, the surrounding area, there was a tremendous amount of earthquakes. There's a journal called the Israel Exploration Journal. This is a blurb, I guess we could say, a blurb from this journal under the article titled "Revised Earthquake Catalog of Palestine." Deke Kalamer Amaran. That's my best attempt at that name. The recognized authority in the history of Israel reports four earthquakes in Palestine in the 2 decades following this discourse, talking about the Olivet Discourse of what we're studying here in Matthew 24, more than for any similar period for over 800 years after. So the number of earthquakes that occurred in Palestine was incredibly more significant than the period of 800 years afterwards. So we can see that the idea of earthquakes, may not have been something new to everybody. Everybody would have most likely understood earthquakes and maybe have experienced earthquakes in the area. But I think what we can see that after Jesus made this prediction, the occurrence of earthquakes was significantly more. There was, an unprecedented amount of earthquakes that happened in this region and throughout the Roman Empire after Jesus made this prediction that at least in Palestine, for the next 800 years, there was not as many earthquakes reported as there was in these few years in this area. So it's significant that we can see that the history and bears out what Jesus said in the predictions of the earthquakes, as being a sign for what he's talking about here in Matthew 24. So one interesting difference between Matthew's account and Luke's account about the Olivet Discourse here, when Jesus is referencing the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew's account is a little bit different. We'll talk about some more differences as we move through, but generally Matthew is referencing a Jewish audience and Luke is generally referencing a Gentile audience. So you'll see differences, maybe some differences in between how they message, the predictions and different things. But this portion of Luke's account, as far as the idea, the prediction of earthquakes and pestilences and famines and things, is almost identical, or at least very similar in wording to Matthew's account, except Luke adds, one more phrase at the end. Luke says in Luke 21, verses 10 through 11, "Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven." So Luke adds the fearful sights and the great signs from heaven. The word for fearful sights there means that which strikes terror. So Matthew doesn't record this for some reason, but Luke does. So he records this additional information. There will be fearful sights that strike terror, and great signs from heaven. So is there any, can we find any evidence of this? Well, it turns out, interestingly enough, that Josephus records things that we could call fearful sights, things that strike terror, and great signs from heaven in his account of the Jewish war. Josephus says there was a sword-shaped star which stayed fixed of the city, and a comet which remained for a whole year. And then before the revolt and the upheaval leading to war, when the people were gathering for the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 8th of the month Xanthicus, so brilliant a light shone round the altar and the sanctuary at the 9th hour of the night that it seemed like broad day, and this lasted for half an hour. And he also says, not many days after the feast, on the 21st of the month Artesimus, there was seen a miraculous apparition which beggars belief. And I imagine that what I'm about to relate would have been thought a mere fairy tale if it had not been confirmed by eyewitnesses which prefigured them. Before sunset, there could be seen in the sky across the whole country chariots and armed battalions speeding through the clouds and circling over the cities. So, to me, I would classify this as fearful sight. If you were to see something like this in the sky, it'd obviously be something that we don't see very often. It would be a fearful sight or something that strikes terror, in those that seen it. There's some people that would confuse this. So as we get closer to around verses 29 and 30, that references, you'll see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven and different things like that. And there's some language there that a lot of people would try to apply to something like this. But in actuality, if you notice that that Josephus mentions, and then before the revolt and the upheaval leading to war. So at least the majority of this happened before the Jews even revolted. So the sign, sometimes some people will try to reference this as the sign of the Son of Man, listed in verse 29 and 30, that part of the context, as being the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will not be destroyed for a good while after this. So the revolt started in 66 A.D. And then the Romans didn't destroy it until about 70 A.D. And all these signs were before the revolt happened. So I don't think it makes sense to say that that would apply to anything other than these fearful sights, these signs in the heavens that Luke mentions in Luke chapter 21. And we'll look more at that as we get into what does the sign of the Son of Man actually refer to in Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31, somewhere in that area. But I think we'll show that it makes sense that doesn't apply to this in any way, form, or fashion. But it can be confusing, and there are some commentators that will try to relate it to. But I don't think that these signs are related to the sign of the Son of Man. I think these have to be related to the fearful sights and the things that are mentioned by Luke in Luke chapter 21. So then Jesus says in verse 8, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. So all these obviously would be everything that he's mentioned, starting in about verse 4, verse 4 through 7. He talked about false Christ deceiving many. He talked about the wars and the rumors of wars, nations rising against nation, famines, pestilences, earthquakes. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. And it's interesting that he used the word, the Greek word there for sorrows, actually means the pain of childbirth, travail pain, or birth pains. So Jesus is, on the idea being, I guess, that all these things are the beginning of the birth pains or the travail pains. I think that's interesting, but I think it also sort of fits the outline of the study that we've been using. So I've been using the idea of a GPS to describe the different sections and the different series of signs that Jesus has given his disciples to bring them up to the point that they should flee Jerusalem. Just to remind ourselves briefly of the outline, so Jesus makes predictions concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 4 through 34. And then we've got verses 4 through 8 are some initial predictions. And we said, he said in verse 6, the end is not yet. These things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. That'd be sort of the equivalent of your GPS telling you, in 2 miles, you're going to get ready to turn. Nothing you need to do right now, but, just know you're getting close. And then as you go through the chapter, like your GPS will tell you, in a quarter of a mile you're going to turn, and then around verse 15 and 16 in Matthew 24 is when your GPS will be telling you to turn right now, right? It's happening now. Now is the time. I think it's interesting that Jesus uses the word sorrow, meaning pain of childbirth, because I think that sort of fits the idea that I'm using here for GPS, being that generally of course, obviously, I've not experienced childbirth myself. Maybe some women can tell me differently, but generally, the pains associated with a child being born should get more severe the closer the child gets to being born, right? When you're, a month away from childbirth, maybe you have little to no pain or much less pain. But as the contractions come on and they get worse and all these things go on as they're supposed to, generally, the pain of childbirth should get worse as the closer the child gets to being born. So that those pains, those birth pains, would be a sign that the child is coming, right? So I think that fits interestingly enough with our sort of the outline that we've laid out here, is that these signs that Jesus is given are signs of basically what he says is going to happen. So I thought that was interesting. It was interesting that he chose the word sorrow there that means birth pains, because I think it fits with sort of how we've been organizing the chapter as we go through it. But verse 8 concludes actually the initial predictions that Jesus has made concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. So he's given his disciples these initial signs. Tells them in verse 6 that these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So there's nothing that they need to do as of right now, but they just know that the time is getting close. So actually, this is all I've got this morning. We'll pick up next week with verse number 9. I thought this was a good place to stop. I didn't really want to get into the additional predictions. It sort of starts another section. I didn't want to get into that I wasn't sure exactly how much time we have left. So next week we'll start fresh with verse number 9. We'll look at some additional predictions that Jesus has given for the destruction of Jerusalem, as the signs point closer and closer to the destruction there. Has anybody got any comments or questions this morning?
Let's go back to verse 2. They asked Jesus, they showed him this temple. They're bragging about that.
Yeah.
Then he says, okay, look at it. It's going to be thrown down. I think that's the key. And then he's leading up to that. Being thrown down.
Right. Yeah.
As you say, the destruction. If you take the whole context, talking to his disciples, he's answering their question.
Well, absolutely.
About the destruction of the throwing down of the temple.
Right, yeah.
And which it was.
Right. Yeah, they asked him, what are...
You can't give 2 or 3 verses, as so many denomination people do, out of context. You got to keep it within that context.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's important through biblical study at all, but I think especially from Matthew 24. So, it's the whole chapter there has to be, because like you said, he's answering these questions. He said the temple's going to be destroyed. And they said, well, what are the signs? What are the signs for that going to be? He's giving them the signs for it. So exactly. So if you take that, if you not understanding the context there and taking that out of context, you can come up with all the ideas that have come out of the religious world that they can use Matthew 24 as that. So it's important to understand that not only through this, but through any biblical study, you have to understand the context for sure. So that's true.
Leading up to verse 8, not only that, it's kind of general knowledge. It's going to remember the Lord and steps and all this. It's going to show the whole conscience. Then verse 8, and these are again sorrow. Then it was like getting this person, and today it's going to take you and
right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he gets a little bit more specific, I think, and you can say that. So he's... Right, yep. Yeah, he makes that clear that all these are just the beginning of the sorrows. But yeah, you're right. It gets a little bit more detailed, I guess, a little bit more personal as you go, because this first section is general, like you're saying, I guess, and then he makes some predictions in verses 9 through 14 associated a lot with the disciples, more specific to them. But then, starting in verse number 15, he gives some predictions that are exactly specific to the city of Jerusalem. These are specific things that are going to happen, that let you know the time is at hand and it's time to get out. So that's true. It's his his predictions get a little bit more detailed, I guess you could say, as it goes through, a little bit more personal as it goes through. So. Anybody else got any questions or comments? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Um, and I think that goes back to what Ed was saying just a minute ago, that if you go to the Bible looking for a sign, I want a sign of something, then you can probably find something that fits a biased view. If you approach it from a biased point of view, I want a sign, or what is this talking about? But there's really a certain amount of, you have to understand the context, right? And you can lead yourself astray by saying, "Well, I want a sign. Let me just look for a sign," or maybe you see a sign in the Bible and you mistakenly apply that to yourself or something. So. Oh yeah, absolutely. And you can get enough. There's enough. It sounds good. I mean, people can give you enough information that, wow, it sounds good to me. It's convincing to me. But the doctrine of premillennialism, there's a lot of things from Matthew 24 and from Daniel that we'll look at as we go through this study that they use to support it. And again, on the surface, it looks good, but if you really look at it, none of those fit the context. Just as a general rule, it's a doctrine that was generated and based on a little bit of information. But if you look at the context of what they're using as cornerstones of that doctrine, it doesn't stand at all. And actually, probably most of the people in the world that would follow that doctrine probably don't even know 90% of what the doctrine actually says, right? They just know there's a tribulation and a 1,000-year reign, but there's a lot of other details. I'm not trying to step on Ed's lesson this morning, but there's a lot of details of it that's associated with it that, if it goes back to the context like we were saying, then you'll see that it's just not true ultimately. So.
Problem today is people don't study for themselves. They listen to some highfalutin guy in the pulpit.
Yeah.
And they trust him, and whatever he says, that's right.
Yeah.
They never study for themselves.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe a lot of people look at it as, well, that's what we pay the preacher for. He knows, and I can ask him. But the individual responsibility is still there. Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. All right. Appreciate all the comments this morning. We'll pick up next week in verse 9.
They, you know, those things.